25 people are dead in New Jersey alone. Let that land for a second. 25 confirmed heat-related fatalities in one state, from a heat dome that parked over the central and eastern United States for the better part of 7 days and refused to move. More than 500 incidents of wind damage were logged in a single 24-hour stretch from the plains to the mid-Atlantic. Over 800,000 utility customers lost power at the peak of it. Atlantic City hit 105 degrees on the 4th of July, a record that had stood since the city started keeping weather records. And right now, as of this morning on July 7th, 60 million people from Ohio to Massachusetts are bracing for flash flooding as rounds of torrential rain continue to hammer the Northeast in the aftermath of that heat dome collapsing. This is what happens when a historic heat event dies. It does not go quietly. There are now flood watches in effect for New York City, Long Island, coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts, and the entire Philadelphia metro, parts of New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania included. The Weather Prediction Center issued a Level 3 out of 4 risk for flash flooding centered on New York City and Long Island this morning. That is a rare designation. Level 3 means the threat is significant and widespread. Rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour are possible in some of these areas today, and storm totals of 3 to 6 inches are expected across the region, with isolated pockets potentially hitting 8 inches. So here is the question I want to answer in this video. Why does a collapsing heat dome produce this kind of violent aftermath? And more importantly, once this week's chaos winds down, where does the heat go next? Because it does not just disappear. The atmosphere does not work that way. And the answer to that second question involves a pattern shift that is one of the most significant I have seen in a summer season in quite a long time. We are going to get into all of it, every piece. The flooding happening today, the next severe weather windows this week, where the heat dome is rebuilding, and the bigger picture, because El Niño is now intensifying rapidly and the World Meteorological Organization dropped a statement this week that I think a lot of people missed. Let me walk you through all of this from the top. When a heat dome breaks down, it does not fade evenly. What happens is this. A cooler air mass, usually pushed down from Canada by a trough developing in the jet stream, starts eating away at the edges of the ridge from the northwest. As that cooler air pushes south, it slams into the moisture-loaded air mass that has been baking under the dome for days. That air mass is saturated. Dew points across the northeast. We're sitting in the upper 60s and low 70s through the holiday weekend, which is essentially tropical. When you take that kind of atmosphere and force cold air into it from above, the instability goes off like a spring being released. Storms fire fast, they fire hard, and because the frontal boundary is not moving quickly, they train repeatedly over the same areas. That is exactly what the Weather Prediction Center meant in their discussion Sunday evening when they wrote that 2 distinct shortwaves moving along a stationary front would generate waves of low pressure moving east and locally enhanced lift over western Pennsylvania and New Jersey into southern New England. 2 shortwaves, same front, same area. Over and over, that is your flash flood recipe for today, July 7th. The GFS and the Euro were in solid agreement through the weekend that this heavy rainfall would persist into Monday and potentially linger into Tuesday across the I-95 corridor. This is not a fast-moving system. This is a stalled boundary with a continuous feed of moisture from the Gulf pushing north, and every embedded shortwave along that front generates another round of convection. AccuWeather meteorologist Peyton Simmers put it clearly. Thunderstorms are training repeatedly over the same locations, and that is how you get catastrophic totals in urban areas. Here is who needs to watch this the most right now. If you are in New York City, on Long Island, in northern New Jersey, in southeastern Connecticut, in Rhode Island, in the Philadelphia metro, in Baltimore, or anywhere along the I-95 corridor from Washington up through Boston, this is an active flash flood situation. The ground is already saturated from this past weekend. There is no absorption capacity left. Every inch of additional rain is going to run off immediately. Streams and creeks that do not normally flood are at risk. Low-lying roads, underpasses, basement apartments, all of these are under elevated threat today. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani issued a direct warning Sunday night telling anyone in a basement apartment to be prepared to evacuate if water begins entering. That is not routine language. Do not drive through flooded roads. Even 6 inches of moving water can knock a person off their feet. And 2 feet can sweep a vehicle off the road. More than 700 flights had already been canceled at New York and New Jersey airports by early afternoon Monday. Ground stops were issued at multiple points throughout the day from the Federal Aviation Administration. If you are trying to travel through the Northeast today or tomorrow, build in significant time and flexibility. Now let me give you a look at this week as a whole, because the severe weather does not end after today. Tuesday, July 8th. The threat of flash flooding begins to contract somewhat as the stationary front finally makes some eastward progress. The WPC still has a slight risk for excessive rainfall across portions of the northern plains on Tuesday as a separate shortwave moves through Montana and into western Minnesota. That system is tapping precipitable water values, running 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 inches, around 2 standard. Deviations above normal for early July, that is a lot of atmospheric moisture for that part of the country. If you are in eastern Montana, northern North Dakota, or western Minnesota, rainfall rates could become locally impressive on Tuesday, and the river and creek levels in those areas need to be watched. Wednesday, July 9th. The Storm Prediction Center's Day 4 through 8 outlook from earlier this week flagged a gradual development of large-scale ridging that begins to emerge across the Intermountain West by midweek. That is a signal I want you to hold on to because I am going to come back to it. But for Wednesday itself, the pattern across the central and eastern states transitions into something messier than any single clear threat. Scattered afternoon thunderstorms remain possible from Texas north through the Ozarks and into the Ohio Valley. The main threats Wednesday are damaging wind gusts and heavy rainfall from slow-moving cells. AccuWeather senior meteorologist Tyler Royce noted that through at least Tuesday and likely into Wednesday, some risk of severe thunderstorms can be expected across nearly a dozen states from Texas to Wisconsin. The setup does not strongly favor organized tornado activity, but I would not rule out an isolated brief tornado in any of these afternoon storm environments. Thursday, July 10th. More of the same across the southern mid-Atlantic. Virginia Beach, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and Myrtle Beach in South Carolina are all going to see daily afternoon and evening storm threats through this period. If you are vacationing along the southeastern Atlantic coast this week, you need to be checking conditions every afternoon and not lingering at the beach or in the water when you see towers building. Friday, July 11th and Saturday, July 12th. Here is where I need you to pay very close attention, because this is where the pattern shift becomes undeniable. The SPC Day 4 through 8 discussion was explicit. As that ridge develops and pushes northeast from the Four Corners area toward northern Colorado, a new heat wave is forecast to build across Colorado and the interior west for this coming weekend. The period from July 11th through the 12th is already being flagged as the next stretch of extreme heat for the Intermountain West. AccuWeather's forecast team put it plainly. The heat dome is flipping. Let me explain what that means in terms you can feel. The dome that just roasted the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Northeast. That dome has fractured. The trough coming out of the Pacific Northwest punched through the western flank of the ridge and broke the blocking pattern. The cool air is flooding into the east, but here is the physics that matters. High-pressure ridges do not just disappear. They migrate. The energy that was locked over the Ohio Valley and the Northeast is now redistributing westward. By later this week and into the weekend, that ridge axis repositions itself over the Intermountain West, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, parts of Nevada, and Arizona. And that is when the West starts cooking. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know whether you are dealing with flooding today or whether you are in the West watching that heat build. Because that split pattern is one of the more dramatic setups I have seen play out in real time this summer. This is the moment in the forecast I want you to lock in. The entire central and western United States is about to swap roles with the East. The East gets a break, a relative break, because the humidity lingers and the storms are not done. But the West? The West is about to bear the full weight of what that ridge brings, and the monsoon is going to complicate everything. AccuWeather's long-range team flagged the North American monsoon becoming active toward the middle of July. Here is how that plays out for the West over the next 7 to 10 days. As that ridge strengthens over the Four Corners region, the wind flow aloft shifts from westerly to southerly. that draws moisture northward from the Gulf of California into Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Initially, and this is the dangerous window, little rain falls. The moisture arrives before the convection organizes. That is the window for dry lightning. Lightning strikes in dry fuel, and in a region that has already seen an active wildfire season this summer, including the Cottonwood Fire in Beaver, Utah, as recently as late June. The dry lightning window is a serious concern. Then, as the monsoon matures and moisture levels rise, afternoon thunderstorms begin to fire more reliably. Haboobs, large dust storms driven by outflow from storms, become a threat across Arizona and New Mexico. Flash flooding along normally dry arroyos becomes a danger. The monsoon is not a comfortable weather pattern. It is dramatic and violent in its own way, just different from the tornado and derecho threats of the Central Plains. And while all of that is happening in the West, the Central Plains in Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri sit in that transition zone where the heat dome's western flank meets the moisture streaming north from the Gulf. That is where I think the most interesting severe weather potential develops between July 12th and 15th. The SPC guidance suggests a broadly cyclonic regime across the northern and middle Atlantic seaboard begins to give way to ridging, but embedded shortwaves remain unclear in terms of their exact timing and intensity. What that means in practical terms is this. The models are telling us the pattern is changing, but the exact days when the next organized severe weather threat sets up are still uncertain beyond 7 days. I will be watching that window very carefully. Now let me give you the big picture, because none of what I just described exists in isolation. All of it. The heat dome, the collapse, the flooding. The flip to the west traces back to a single atmospheric driver that is now intensifying faster than most models projected even a month ago. Niño, the World Meteorological Organization, issued a major statement this past week. Multi-model ensemble forecasts from leading global producing centers show a consistent and significant warming of ocean temperatures across the central and eastern equatorial Pacific, with seasonal average sea surface temperature anomalies expected to exceed 2 degrees Celsius in key monitoring regions by July through September. The WMO noted, and this is direct from their seasonal climate update, that forecast models show remarkable agreement, providing high confidence in the outlook. El Niño is expected to continue strengthening during the Northern Hemisphere autumn. To put that in context for you, NOAA confirmed El Niño conditions in June. The Niño 3.4 index was already approaching +1 at the start of this month, getting close to moderate El Niño status. The models that CNN consulted this week show recent projections have trended toward a more intense El Niño at its peak strength compared to previous simulations. One researcher at Columbia University's Climate Science Group called this El Niño unusual in multiple respects, not just because it is developing early, but because it is developing in a fundamentally warmer climate than past events. The baseline is hotter, so the anomalies are stacking on top of that higher floor. Here is why that matters for the rest of your summer and into fall. El Niño's most direct impact on summer. Weather in the continental United States comes through the jet stream. When sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific warm significantly, they alter the atmospheric pressure gradient across the basin. That drives changes in the Walker circulation, the massive east-to-west airflow that organizes tropical convection. As that circulation weakens, the subtropical jet stream across the southern United States strengthens and shifts. The WMO's July through September rainfall outlook reflects this explicitly. Enhanced likelihood of above-normal rainfall is forecast across the southwestern United States as that subtropical jet activates. That is your monsoon connection. That is why the monsoon may be more active than usual this summer. But there is a second impact that concerns me more for the eastern United States. Strong El Niño events tend to increase vertical wind shear over the Atlantic Basin and the Caribbean. That is why NOAA's 2026 hurricane season forecast called for a below-normal season, 8 to 14 named storms, with a 55% chance of a below-normal year. El Niño is the dominant suppression mechanism. Wind shear inhibits hurricane formation and intensification in the main development region, extending from the Lesser Antilles to the African coast. The NHC confirmed this past Monday morning that no tropical cyclone formation is anticipated in the Atlantic. Caribbean, or the Gulf in the next 7 days. And I want to be careful here because this is important, El Niño suppressing the deep tropics does not mean the Gulf Coast is safe this summer. Tropical storm Arthur, already formed in mid-June. It developed from a disturbance in the northwestern Gulf, made landfall near the Texas-Louisiana border, and dropped significant rainfall across the Gulf Coast before weakening. The Bay of Campeche and the Western Gulf remain areas I am watching closely. The remnant moisture from Pacific Tropical Storm Christina moved into the Gulf over the past week. The National Hurricane Center was briefly giving a 10% chance of reformation in the Atlantic. That kind of moisture transport from Pacific systems into the Gulf is something that becomes more common under a strong El Niño setup, particularly as the Pacific becomes hyperactive with storms like Amanda, Boris, and Christina, all forming in the eastern Pacific this season. This is one of the strongest El Niño signals I have seen in a summer season in at least a decade. The WMO is calling for sea surface temperature anomalies exceeding 2 degrees Celsius in key monitoring regions. That approaches the threshold NOAA uses to classify a very strong event. If these forecasts verify, the late summer and early fall pattern for the United States could look significantly different from what most people are expecting. The subtropical jet staying active means continued elevated moisture across the southern tier. Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Florida Panhandle. These areas face above normal precipitation risk through the summer. And as the jet shifts and the Pacific pattern evolves, there is real potential for organized Gulf development windows to open up later in the season, particularly in August, when the El Niño-driven shear in the Caribbean may shift in ways that are still uncertain. I said I would come back to the jet stream, and I'm going to do that now. Because the jet is the thread that ties this entire story together. What we just watched happen over the past 10 days is a textbook demonstration of what happens when the jet stream locks into a highly amplified omega block pattern and then breaks down. The omega block, named for its resemblance to the Greek letter omega in the upper-level wind map, is a configuration where a high-pressure ridge is flanked by 2 troughs, one on each side. The ridge sits stationary for days or weeks because the troughs on either side pump warm air into it from the south and prevent it from moving. That is why this heat dome sat over the central and eastern United States for almost 7 full days. The omega block held it in place. When omega blocks break down, they do not dissolve gradually. They break down rapidly and dramatically when one of the flanking troughs gains enough energy to penetrate the ridge. That is what happened over the 4th of July weekend. The trough out of the Pacific Northwest punched through the western side of the ridge, and the collapse happened in about 48 hours. That is fast enough to produce exactly the kind of violent convective outbreak that we saw. 500 wind damage reports in a single day, gusts up to 92 miles per hour at Norman, Oklahoma, and the life-threatening flooding that is still ongoing today across the Northeast. NWS State College put it directly in their area forecast discussion on Sunday. Rare heat at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 3 consecutive days with maximum temperatures at or above 100 degrees from July 2nd through 4th. Only the 6th time on record going back to 1888. The last time that happened was 1999. Are you watching from somewhere that got hit hardest by this heat dome? I want to know. Drop your city and tell me whether you lost power, whether you dealt with storms, whether you had basement flooding. Because the human picture of this event is something I have been tracking carefully all week. Now let me pull this all the way out to the largest frame I can. Multiple researchers and climate scientists who spoke publicly this week made the same observation. This heat dome, concurrent with an equally severe European heat wave last week, is part of a pattern that becomes more frequent and more intense in a warming world. Michael Mann at the University of Pennsylvania put it this way: record sea surface temperatures, partly from El Niño and partly from longer-term human-caused warming, fuel more extreme weather. Warmer oceans mean more moisture in the atmosphere, which intensifies storm systems and produces heavier rainfall. And the record global ocean temperatures also mean more extreme heat when blocking patterns set up. The NOAA analysis confirms this. Climate change is making heat waves hotter and more prolonged. The average number of heat waves in the United States is increasing, and when they end, the collapse produces the exact kind of violent, severe weather sequence we are watching unfold right now. I also want to flag something that I think is genuinely unusual for a summer heat event. The mapper analysis of this event noted that it is unusual to see two major heat domes parked over North America and Europe in the same week. And it is. European forecasters were dealing with their own severe event last week. At almost the exact same time, the dome was intensifying over the central United States. That kind of simultaneous amplified blocking on both continents is a pattern that researchers have linked to a weakening and wavier polar jet stream. And LD. Niño is one of the factors that can contribute to that waviness. This is also not the first significant heat event of 2026. Severe weather Europe documented a spring heat dome in March that pushed temperatures 20 to 40 degrees above average from California to Texas. That was the first major event. This July dome was the second, and based on the current trajectory of El Niño and the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, I do not think it will be the last. The WMO's forecast is for El Niño to strengthen through the fall. What that means for the late summer pattern, particularly whether we see additional blocking, high events over the central or western United States in August and September, is something I will be watching very closely. Before I get to the tropics update, let me do a quick rundown of where I think the significant weather risks concentrate this week and into next week, because I want to make sure you walk away from this video with actionable information for your area, not just the big picture. Today, July 7th. Flash flood threat is the headline story. Level 3 out of 4 risk for New York City, Long Island, coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts. Level 2 risk from central Massachusetts through New Jersey, the Delmarva Peninsula, and western Pennsylvania. Rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour are possible. Up to 8 inches of total accumulation in isolated locations. Flood watch is in effect through Monday evening for portions of northern Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia, Berks, Carbon, Lehigh, Northampton, Monroe, and Bucks counties. Travel is significantly impacted. More than 700 flights canceled at regional airports. Do not underestimate this event. Tonight into early Tuesday, the frontal boundary begins a slow eastward progression. Rainfall continues, though intensity may begin to diminish for the immediate New York metro as we get into the overnight hours. Watch for river flooding to develop or worsen on smaller watersheds in Pennsylvania and New Jersey as the accumulated rain from the past several days works its way downstream. Wednesday through Friday. The Central Plains and Ohio Valley remain unsettled with daily afternoon and evening storm chances. Isolated severe weather cannot be ruled out on any given day. Wind gusts and heavy rainfall are the primary threats. The tornado risk is generally low through this period, though not zero. By Friday, eyes shift to the west weekend of July 11th and 12th. New heat wave building across Colorado and the interior west. This is the next significant event I am tracking. Temperatures in the interior west will be climbing. The North American monsoon may begin activating as moisture streams northward from the Gulf of California. The dangerous early monsoon window. Dry lightning. Elevated fire weather is something the West needs to prepare for heading into this weekend. Now I want to come back to the tropics, because there is actually a meaningful update today that involves the Bay of Campeche, and it connects directly to the pattern I have been describing. The NHC confirmed Monday morning that no tropical cyclone formation is expected in the Atlantic, Caribbean, or the Gulf in the next 7 days. That is a clean forecast for now. The strong El Niño-driven shear in the deep tropics is doing exactly what NOAA predicted, suppressing activity in the main development region. The Atlantic sea surface temperatures, while slightly above normal in the western portions of the basin near the Gulf and the western Atlantic, are running below normal or near normal across much of the main development region extending from the Antilles toward Africa. NOAA's outlook calls for 8 to 14 named storms total this season, with a 55% chance of a below-normal year. For context, an average season produces 14 named storms with 7 hurricanes. That said, Tropical Storm Arthur already formed in mid-June, and the remnant moisture from Pacific Tropical Storm Christina has been influencing rainfall patterns across southeast Texas and the Gulf Coast all week. The Bay of Campeche and Northwest Gulf received a low probability watch from the NHC for potential Christina reformation. That number was around 10% before the system lost coherence. But what I want you to understand is this. The moisture transport pathway from the eastern Pacific into the Gulf is active and will remain active as El Niño strengthens. Pacific systems like Boris and Christina that dissipate over Central America do not just vanish. Their moisture feeds northward into the Gulf Basin. And that moisture can interact with disturbances, frontal systems, and even areas of organized convection in ways that occasionally produce Gulf development. I am not calling for a Gulf storm in the near term. The sheer picture does not support it right now. But I am telling you that the moisture feed from the Pacific into the Gulf is something I watch very carefully through the rest of July and into August, especially as the North American monsoon activates and the atmospheric circulation patterns evolve. The full tropical season picture from NOAA's outlook is worth sitting with. 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, 1 to 3 major hurricanes. That is a below-normal forecast. But as NOAA Director Ken Graham said when the outlook was released, it only takes one. A below-normal season means fewer storms overall. It does not mean 0 storms affecting the United States coastline. It does not mean the Gulf Coast is protected. It means the statistical probability of an active season is reduced. The probability of a single significant hurricane affecting the coast is not reduced to 0. I want to make sure you are subscribed to this channel and have notifications turned on, and because this pattern is moving fast and the forecast is going to shift several times over the next 2 weeks as El Niño strengthens, the western heat dome builds, and the monsoon activates. My name is Arthur, and I am going to be putting out daily updates through this active period. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. And genuinely, if you find this level of data useful, share this with someone in the Northeast dealing with flooding today, or someone in Colorado who needs to start paying attention to what is building this weekend. Let me give you a few specific numbers to close out the climate and tropics picture, because the numbers in this event have been genuinely staggering and I want to make sure they register. Atlantic City, New Jersey, 105 degrees on July 4th. That was an all-time July record. Washington, D.C., 103 degrees on July 4th, with an all-time warmest overnight low of 84 degrees. New York City's Central Park hit 100 degrees on July 2nd, first triple-digit reading in almost 14 years. Philadelphia hit 103. Boston hit 101. Newark hit 104. Baltimore hit 103 on July 3rd. At Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 3 consecutive days above 100 degrees. Only the 6th time since 1888. La Crosse, Wisconsin logged a low temperature of 81 degrees on June 30th, tying the city's all-time warmest overnight low going back to 1872. Over the weekend, the storm that developed as the dome collapsed logged a peak wind gust of 92 miles per hour at Norman, Oklahoma. More than 500 wind damage reports were filed across the plains, Midwest, and Mid-Atlantic in a single day. More than 800,000 utility customers lost power at the peak of the event. At least 25 confirmed heat-related deaths in New Jersey alone. The national total is being investigated, but is at minimum 25 and likely higher. This was an historic event. Not in the way the word gets thrown around loosely. I mean that literally. Multiple stations set records going back over a century. Multiple records that had never been broken or tied since weather. Records began were tied or broken in this single event, and the atmosphere is not done with us yet. The heat dome is rebuilding in the west. The flooding threat is active today across the Northeast. El Niño is strengthening toward what could become a very strong event. The monsoon is activating, and there are still active wildfire risks in Utah and surrounding states from the prolonged dry and hot conditions this spring and summer. Tomorrow, I am going to be watching the Northern Plains shortwave very closely for Tuesday's severe weather potential in Montana, North Dakota, and western Minnesota. And I am going to be keeping a close eye on how quickly the western ridge builds heading into the weekend. The rate at which that ridge amplifies will tell me a lot about whether we are looking at a one-week heat event in the west or something. That could extend significantly longer. If you are watching from somewhere in this forecast area and you are seeing impacts right now, flooding, storm damage, heat, leave your city in the comments. I read every single one, and I use that ground truth to sharpen these forecasts. This community gives me real-time information that the models cannot. Stay weather aware today, be patient with your travel plans, and keep an eye on that western ridge as we head toward the weekend. The story of this heat dome is not over. It just moved. There is something I have not talked about yet that I want to address directly. The power grid. What this heat dome exposed, and this is something that goes beyond just the weather numbers, is how close the eastern United States power grid came to a serious failure during the peak of this event. The Department of Energy ordered all electrical generators to run at full capacity, including backup units. That was the second time this summer that order was issued. Let that sink in. The second time. We are 1 month into meteorological summer, and the grid has already been pushed to maximum output twice. The reason this matters for the weather conversation is that it changes the risk calculus for heat events. When the grid is strained, people who rely on air conditioning lose it. And when people lose cooling in a heat dome environment, heat indices above 110 degrees, overnight lows in the upper 70s to low 80s that prevent any recovery, the risk of heat illness and death escalates dramatically. New Jersey Health Commissioner Raynard Washington was explicit about this at a news conference on Saturday. Many of the 25 victims were found in homes without air conditioning. Some were outside. Some were in parked cars. The combination of record heat and a fragile grid is a genuinely dangerous pairing. And it is a pairing that is going to become more common, not less, as El Niño strengthens and future heat events build on a warmer baseline. The baseline is hotter now. As the NWS meteorologist Joe Wegman said during the peak of this event, we are looking at temperatures generally 100 to 105 degrees across a broad area, and that floor is set by a climate system that is warmer than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I want to give you the day-by-day temperature picture for the West now, because this is the next thing you need to be watching. Right now, today on July 7th, the interior West is already sitting in the 90s. Colorado's Front Range is pushing into the mid-90s. Phoenix and the desert Southwest are running in the upper 100 teens, which is typical for this time of year in the low desert, but atypical in the sense that the nighttime lows are elevated, offering less recovery. Las Vegas is running near 111. Salt Lake City is in the upper 90s. This is the ambient baseline the new ridge is building on top of. By Thursday, July 10th, that ridge begins to assert itself more strongly. The Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, is where the initial intensification concentrates. The GFS ensemble suite shows the core of the highest heights migrating northeast from the Four Corners toward northern Colorado by the end of the week. That motion matters because it determines where the peak heat ends up. If the core stays near the Four Corners, Arizona and Utah see the most extreme temperatures. If it migrates northeast, as the latest guidance suggests, then Colorado's eastern slope, the Front Range cities like Denver, Fort Collins and Colorado Springs, and eventually the high plains of eastern Colorado and western Kansas come into play by the weekend of July 11th and 12th. This is what the SPC Day 4 through 8 discussion was flagging when they wrote about seasonably high mid-level heights, evolving and developing northeastward, west through north of the Four Corners into northern Colorado. That is a ridge centered near the Colorado-Wyoming border by the end of the period. Denver could be looking at temperatures in the triple digits heading into next weekend. The last time Denver hit 100 degrees was earlier this summer during the spring heat event in March. Seeing it again in mid-July is not unprecedented. But back-to-back extreme heat events within a single summer are a signal worth noting. Wyoming, Montana's south, Nebraska's panhandle. All of these areas are going to feel the edge of this western ridge as it builds. The question is how far east the heat dome's influence extends. Does it stay west of the Rockies, or does it spill far enough east to affect western Kansas and Nebraska? The ensemble guidance right now is somewhat uncertain on that question, and it is something I am going to be tracking daily as we get closer to the weekend. Here is another piece of this that most people are not talking about. Wildfire, the Cottonwood Fire in Beaver. Utah burned in late June under dry, hot conditions. The western United States has been primed by months of below-normal precipitation in some areas and above-normal temperatures almost everywhere. The combination of that fire-scarred terrain, the elevated fuel moisture deficits, and now a fresh heat dome building over the region, creates a setup that fire weather forecasters take very seriously. AccuWeather's forecast team was specific. As the monsoon develops and before it matures enough to bring significant rainfall, The initial period is characterized by dry lightning and elevated wildfire danger. That window, probably between July 9th and 15th, is the one I would watch most carefully from a fire perspective if you are in Utah, Colorado, Nevada, or Arizona. When the monsoon does arrive with meaningful moisture, you shift from fire risk to flash flood risk. The desert Southwest has some of the highest flash flood vulnerability in the country during monsoon season because the terrain is hard-baked from dry heat. The drainage channels are steep and confined, and rainfall rates from monsoon thunderstorms can be extreme, 2 to 3 inches in an hour over a single watershed. People die in arroyo flooding every monsoon season. The transition from fire risk to flood risk happens in a matter of days or even hours as the monsoon advances. That is not an exaggeration. It is the nature of that atmospheric pattern. I said earlier that this El Niño event is one of the strongest summer signals I have seen in a long time. I want to go deeper on that because the WMO statement from this week deserves more attention than it has gotten in the mainstream weather conversation. The July through September 2026 rainfall outlook from the WMO reflects a pattern consistent with a strengthening El Niño event. Enhanced likelihood of above-normal rainfall is forecast across the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. Below-normal rainfall is more likely across parts of Central America, the Caribbean, and northwestern South America. Across the southwestern United States, and this is the piece I keep coming back to, wetter than average conditions are more likely. That is the active monsoon signal. That is NOAA and the WMO both pointing at the southwest and saying moisture levels will run above normal. Now take that and put it alongside the NOAA prediction of a 63% chance of sea surface, temperatures exceeding 2 degrees Celsius above normal in the Niño monitored region of the Pacific by fall. 2 degrees Celsius above the baseline in the key monitoring region is the threshold NOAA uses to call an event very strong. We are potentially heading for a very strong El Niño, not moderate, not strong, very strong. The last very strong El Niño was the 2015 to 2016 event. That event brought historic drought to the western Pacific, exceptional rainfall to parts of the central United States, and a disrupted Atlantic hurricane season. It also influenced the global average surface temperature significantly, contributing to the warmest year on record at that time. The current event is developing in a climate system that is already warmer than 2015. The floor, again, is higher. What does a very strong El Niño in the second half of 2026 mean for weather across the United States through the fall and into winter? I want to be honest with you. This is where the uncertainty increases substantially. Because the full downstream effects of El Niño on United States weather are most pronounced in the fall and winter, and we are looking at projections that are still 4 to 6 months out in some cases. What I can tell you is what the typical El Niño fingerprint looks like and where you should be paying attention. The subtropical jet stream strengthens and shifts south. That brings increased storm track activity across the southern tier of the country. Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. Wetter conditions in the south and southwest during fall and winter. The northern tier of the country, the northern plains, Great Lakes, upper Midwest. New England tends to see warmer than normal temperatures during El Niño winters, as the storm track keeps the deep cold locked up in Canada. That is not guaranteed. There are other atmospheric patterns that can override El Niño's influence. But it is the expected statistical tendency, and with a potentially very strong event, those tendencies may be stronger than usual. The hurricane season suppression is already visible in the data. The Atlantic is quiet right now. No formation expected in the next 7 days per the NHC. The main development region is running below normal sea surface temperatures in its central portions. Wind shear is elevated. The season is trending exactly as NOAA predicted, below normal. But I want to say one more time, because this is the most important thing I can tell you about hurricane season during an El Niño year. Below normal season does not mean zero Gulf Coast risk. It means fewer storms form in the deep tropics. It says nothing about the Western Caribbean, the Bay of Campeche, or Gulf development. And as Tropical Storm Arthur showed us last month, the Gulf can produce storms even when the broader Atlantic is quiet. Watch the Gulf. Watch the Bay of Campeche specifically. Watch for Pacific moisture transport into the Gulf Basin as the monsoon activates. These are the development windows that deserve your attention, even in a suppressed El Niño season. Let me bring this back to today one final time, because I do not want to send you into your week without absolute clarity on the immediate situation. It is July 7th. The flash flood threat in the Northeast is active right now. New York City, Long Island, coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts. Level 3 out of 4 risk for flash flooding as of this morning. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania broadly. Level 2. Flood watch is in effect through Monday evening across multiple counties. Rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour possible. Totals of 3 to 6 inches expected regionally with isolated spots hitting 8. More than 500,000 customers without power as of early this morning across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the broader region. More than 700 flights canceled. If you are in these areas today, the single most important thing you can do is not drive into flooded roads. Turn around, don't drown. It is not a slogan. It is the reason people die in flash floods. Moving water is far more powerful than it looks. 12 inches of fast-moving water can knock a vehicle off its footing. 2 feet will sweep most passenger vehicles downstream. If you encounter a flooded road, reverse and find another route. No destination is worth your life. The pattern evolution through the rest of this week points toward gradual improvement in the Northeast. Increasing severe weather risk in the northern plains by midweek, and the next major heat event building in the west by the weekend. I will be updating you every day as this plays out. Tomorrow, I will be specifically watching the shortwave moving through Montana and North Dakota to assess Tuesday's flooding and severe weather potential in the northern plains. And I will be watching the latest GFS and Euro runs carefully for any signal changes on the western ridges, timing and intensity heading into next weekend. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is happening and what is coming, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is the kind of pattern where staying ahead of the forecast matters. Decisions about travel, about outdoor plans, about preparedness for both the flooding threat today and the heat threat building in the west. Those decisions are better when you have real data behind them. And as always, where are you watching from? Are you dealing with flooding right now? Did your city get hit by this heat dome? Leave your city in the comments. This community's ground truth makes every forecast I put out better. The dome collapsed. The violence followed. And the heat is already finding its next home.